It was the summer of 1370 in Siena, Italy. The sun beat down mercilessly on the terracotta rooftops, and the narrow medieval streets shimmered with heat. Inside a small stone cell attached to a modest home, a young woman lay completely motionless on the cold floor. Her name was Catherine Benincasa, known to history as Catherine of Siena, and by all appearances, she was dead. Her followers gathered around her body, their faces pale with shock and grief. These were people who had witnessed many extraordinary things in Catherine's presence, ecstasies, visions, apparent miracles, but nothing had prepared them for this. One woman pressed a polished mirror to Catherine's lips, watching desperately for the slightest fog of breath. Nothing. Another pressed trembling fingers to her wrist, searching for even the faintest flutter of pulse. Nothing. Her skin had taken on a waxy, bluish pallor that comes only when blood has stopped flowing. Her limbs had grown cold and stiff, resisting any attempt to move them. Her eyes, partially open, stared at nothing, fixed and glassy as those of a corpse. The room grew thick with the smell of candle smoke and the sharp edge of fear. Hours passed. The summer light shifted through the small window, crawling slowly across the stone floor. But Catherine did not move. Not a twitch, not a flicker. The whispers began spreading through the neighborhood like wildfire. The holy woman is dead. Catherine is gone. Neighbors began to arrive, peering through the doorway with a mixture of curiosity and genuine sorrow. Someone suggested they should begin the preparations for burial. In the Italian summer heat, a body could not be left long without proper care. Linens were fetched. Someone lit additional candles and placed them around her body in the traditional arrangement. The heavy scent of incense filled the small room as mourners began the ancient rituals that had accompanied death for countless generations. For 4 hours, that's how long the historical accounts tell us Catherine remained in this death-like state. 4 hours in which her heart did not beat, her lungs did not draw breath, and her soul, according to what she would later testify under solemn oath, was no longer in her body at all. It had traveled somewhere else entirely. Somewhere that human beings are not meant to visit while still tethered to mortal flesh. But then, just as the sun began its descent toward the hills of Tuscany, casting long shadows through the narrow streets of Siena, something impossible happened. Catherine's eyelids fluttered. A sharp, rattling gasp escaped her lips. The kind of desperate sound a drowning person makes when they finally break the surface of the water. And the woman whose body had already been prepared for burial suddenly sat up, her eyes wide and wild with an expression that no one present had ever seen before, or would ever forget for the rest of their lives. The mourners scrambled backward in shock and terror. One woman screamed. Several fell immediately to their knees, crossing themselves frantically and calling upon all the saints. But Catherine did not seem to notice them at all. She was staring at something far beyond the stone walls of her cell, beyond the city of Siena, beyond the hills of Tuscany, beyond the world itself. What had she witnessed during those 4 hours? Where had her soul traveled while her body lay cold and lifeless on the floor? The answer she gave would haunt everyone who heard it, and it continues to disturb and fascinate believers and skeptics alike. More than 650 years later, "My soul was delivered out of this mortal body," Catherine whispered, her voice hoarse and cracking, barely audible. The room fell absolutely silent. I saw the pains of hell and of purgatory, and no human tongue could ever describe what I witnessed there. This is the story of what Saint Catherine of Siena experienced during her mystical death. A journey through the darkest regions of eternity that would transform her from a simple woman of Siena into one of the most influential figures in the entire history of Christianity. But to understand the full weight of what she witnessed, we must first understand who Catherine was, and the extraordinary path that led her to that stone floor in the summer of 1370. Catherine was born in 1347 in Siena, a prosperous city-state in the heart of Tuscany. Her father, Giacomo Benincasa, was a wool dyer, a respectable trade that placed the family firmly in the solid middle class of medieval Italian society. Her mother, Lapa, was a practical, strong-willed woman who had given birth to an almost unbelievable number of children over the course of her marriage. Catherine was the 24th. Her twin sister died in infancy, as so many children did in those harsh times. Think about that for a moment. The 24th of 25 children. In most families, such a child would be entirely overlooked, lost in the crowd of siblings all competing for food, attention, and the limited resources of a medieval household. Children in those days often blurred together in their parents' memories, distinguished only by gender and birth order. But from her very earliest moments, Catherine stood dramatically and unmistakably apart from every other child her parents had ever known. At age 6, while walking home with her brother Stefano through the winding streets of Siena, she suddenly stopped in her tracks and stared at the sky above the church of San Domenico. Her brother tugged at her hand impatiently, urging her to keep moving. They were expected home, and their mother absolutely did not tolerate lateness. But Catherine was frozen in place, completely unresponsive to his demands. Her small face transformed by an expression of absolute wonder and joy. Years later, she would describe what she saw that day. A vision of Christ himself, seated on a magnificent throne of shimmering glory, surrounded by the apostles Peter, Paul, and John. Christ was dressed in the robes of a pope, brilliant white and gold, and he was looking directly at her, not through her, not past her, but at her specifically, with a gaze of infinite love and recognition that pierced straight through to her soul. As she watched, transfixed and unable to move or speak, Christ raised his hand and made the sign of blessing over her, as if commissioning her for some great work that she could not yet understand. That single moment changed absolutely everything. While other girls her age played with dolls, chased each other through the streets, and dreamed of the fine dresses they would wear on their wedding days, Catherine began spending hours in solitary prayer. She would sneak away to hidden corners of the house, behind barrels in the cellar, in unused storage rooms, anywhere she could find a moment of solitude, and kneel on the hard floor until her knees bled, whispering long conversations with an invisible presence that she insisted was more real than anything in the visible world. She began practicing small mortifications with a seriousness unusual for any child, refusing desserts and sweet treats, giving away her food to beggars in the street, sleeping on the hard floor instead of her comfortable bed. She was only 7 years old, and already she was living like a nun. Her parents, practical people focused on survival and social advancement in a competitive world, grew increasingly concerned. This was not normal behavior for a child of any age. When Catherine turned 12, they began pressuring her seriously to prepare for marriage. In medieval Italy, a girl of good family was expected to be betrothed by 12 or 13 and married by 14 or 15 at the latest. A good match could elevate the entire family's standing in society. Catherine's beauty, her golden hair, her bright and intelligent eyes, her graceful manner, made her a potentially valuable asset in the marriage market. But Catherine had already made other plans. In the secret depths of her heart, known to no one but herself and God, she had made a vow of perpetual virginity to the Blessed Virgin Mary, promising to take Christ alone as her spouse for all eternity. She had told no one of this sacred vow, understanding perfectly well that her family would never accept it. When her mother Lapa began insisting that Catherine curl her hair in the fashionable style, wear fine clothes that showed off her figure, and use cosmetics to enhance her natural beauty for potential suitors, Catherine initially went along with it. She was pressured heavily by her beloved older sister Bonaventura, who had recently made an excellent marriage and wanted the same happiness for her younger sister. But when Bonaventura died suddenly in childbirth, Catherine was absolutely devastated. She saw her sister's death as divine punishment for her own momentary vanity and compromise. Never again, she resolved with an iron determination. Never again would she compromise with the demands of the world. And so she performed an act of stunning and irreversible defiance. She retreated to her room, found a sharp knife, and with her own hands cut off all her beautiful golden hair. The hair that her mother had spent hours curling and arranging, the hair that was supposed to attract a wealthy husband, the hair that connected her to the world of marriage and motherhood and ordinary female existence. Her mother Lapa was absolutely furious, angrier than Catherine had ever seen her. Her father Giacomo was completely baffled. How could they possibly marry off a daughter who looked like a shorn sheep? Lapa tried everything she could think of to change her daughter's mind, pleading, reasoning, threatening severe punishment. As a final desperate measure, the family dismissed their servant and forced Catherine to do all the household work herself. She would cook every meal, clean every room, wash all the clothes, haul water from the well, tend the fire, and serve her entire family's needs from dawn until well after dark. They hoped that this exhausting drudgery would finally break her stubborn spirit and bring her back to her senses. Instead, Catherine transformed the punishment into something sacred. She imagined that she was serving the Holy Family itself. Her father Giacomo became Saint Joseph in her mind's eye. Her mother Lapa became the Blessed Virgin Mary. Her many brothers and sisters became the apostles and holy women of the Gospels. Every pot she scrubbed became a sacred vessel. Every floor she swept became the floor of the temple in Jerusalem. Every meal she prepared was an offering laid before Christ himself. Rather than crushing her spirit as her parents had hoped, the labor deepened her mystical life in ways that no one could have anticipated. One night, her father Giacomo happened to pass by her small room and glanced casually through the doorway. What he saw stopped him cold and made him tremble with sudden fear. His daughter was kneeling in prayer, her face illuminated by something far more brilliant than candlelight. And hovering above her head was a white dove, luminous and otherworldly, casting its own soft radiance that filled the entire room. The bird remained there for several heartbeats, completely still, before slowly fading into pure light and disappearing. Giacomo stood trembling in the doorway, suddenly and terrifyingly aware that his daughter was no ordinary girl. This was something beyond his understanding, beyond his world, beyond anything he had ever experienced in his long life. The next morning, he gathered the entire family together. "Let her follow whatever path she chooses," he announced, his voice unsteady with emotion. "None of us must oppose her in any way, for any reason. She is clearly called to something far beyond our poor understanding." From that day forward, Catherine was free to pursue her vocation without interference. But freedom, for her, did not mean comfort or ease or the ordinary pleasures of life. It meant the beginning of a journey into spiritual extremity that would shock even the most hardened religious men of her time. At 16, Catherine was finally permitted to join the Mantelat, a group of lay Dominican women who wore the distinctive black and white habit of the Dominican order, but continued to live in their own homes, rather than withdrawing into enclosed convents. These women were typically older widows, women who had fulfilled their duties to family and society, and were now free to dedicate themselves to prayer and charitable works. Catherine was decades younger than any of them, and many of the older women objected strongly to accepting someone so young into their ranks. But after meeting Catherine and speaking with her at length, the Dominican friars who oversaw the group made an exception. They recognized something extraordinary in this young woman: a spiritual maturity, a depth of prayer, a burning love of God that far exceeded anything they had encountered in women twice her age. For the next 3 years, Catherine essentially became a hermit within her own family home. She confined herself to a tiny room, barely larger than a closet, rarely speaking to anyone except her confessor. She slept perhaps an hour or two each night, if she slept at all, usually on bare wooden boards that offered no comfort to her exhausted body. She ate almost nothing: a few raw vegetables, some bitter herbs, occasionally a communion wafer. Water was her only drink. She wore a rough iron chain around her waist that bit painfully into her flesh with every movement, drawing blood that stained her simple habit. These extreme practices of mortification were not uncommon among mystics of the Middle Ages. Saints and holy men throughout Christian history had subjected their bodies to severe disciplines, understanding them as ways of dying to self and uniting more closely with Christ's own suffering on the cross. But even by the demanding standards of her time, Catherine pushed herself to astonishing extremes that worried everyone who knew her. Her biographer and confessor, Blessed Raymond of Capua, who spent years gathering detailed testimony about her life from those who knew her personally, wrote that she seemed to survive on divine grace alone, that the normal physical laws governing human survival simply did not apply to this extraordinary woman. But this period of solitary prayer was far from peaceful. Catherine would later describe it as a time of horrific spiritual warfare, a sustained battle against forces of darkness that assaulted her with terrifying persistence day and night. She was tormented by demons, and these were not vague metaphorical struggles or passing dark thoughts of the kind that trouble ordinary believers. These were vivid, visceral, overwhelmingly real manifestations that came to her whether she was waking or sleeping. Sometimes the demons appeared as beautiful people, handsome men who tempted her to impurity with seductive words and disturbing images, elegant women who mocked her ugly cropped hair and poor rough clothes. Sometimes they came as disembodied voices whispering that her prayers were completely worthless, that God had never loved her, that her entire religious life was a pathetic delusion that would inevitably end in damnation and despair. Night after night in her tiny cell, Catherine battled these invisible forces that sought relentlessly to destroy her faith and drag her soul into eternal despair. She would cry out in anguish, weeping and sweating and trembling, wrestling with entities that she could not see with her physical eyes, but whose presence was as real and as terrifying as any physical attacker. Some nights, she felt as if she were being crushed beneath an immense weight of impenetrable darkness, pressed down until she could not breathe, could not think, could not remember a single word of prayer. "Where were you, Lord, when my heart was so full of darkness and filth?" she once asked Christ during one of her mystical conversations. His answer would become absolutely central to her spirituality and to the teachings she would later share with thousands. "I was in your heart, daughter. My presence was there all along, every moment of every night. It was my presence dwelling within you that kept you from consenting to those evil thoughts. Do you not understand? If I had not been dwelling in the very center of your heart, those terrible temptations would have brought you pleasure instead of pain. You would have embraced them instead of fighting them. The very disgust you felt, the very agony of resistance. That was me, holding you close in my arms, even when you could not feel my presence at all. This profound insight, that God's presence is often felt most powerfully, not through pleasure and consolation, but through the very pain of resisting evil, would shape everything Catherine later taught and wrote. God does not abandon us in our darkest moments, even when we feel utterly alone. He is there in the struggle itself, in the refusal to give in the choice to keep fighting even when all seems completely lost. By 1370, Catherine had emerged from her years of solitary prayer and had spent several years in active ministry in the streets and hospitals of Siena. The shy, hidden girl had transformed into a fearless woman of action who astonished everyone who encountered her. She had nursed plague victims when others fled in terror, wiping the oozing sores and washing the fevered bodies of the sick and dying, while healthy neighbors locked their doors and shuttered their windows against the contagion. She had visited prisoners condemned to death, walking alongside them to the executioner's block, holding their trembling hands as the blade fell, praying their souls safely into eternity. She had also begun to attract an extraordinary group of followers, people from all walks of life who recognized in her something they had never encountered anywhere else. They called themselves the Caterinati, the family of Catherine. They were men and women, ordained priests and ordinary laypeople, wealthy nobles and poor commoners, educated scholars and illiterate peasants, all drawn irresistibly by her extraordinary spiritual gifts and her fierce, fearless love. They called her Mama, Mother, despite the fact that she was younger than many of them, still barely into her 20s. It was during this period, in the scorching heat of a Tuscan summer, sometime between July and August of 1370, that the event occurred which would define her legacy for all time. Catherine had been praying with particular intensity for the salvation of souls. This was not an abstract theological concern for her. It was a burning, consuming obsession that occupied her waking hours and haunted her dreams. She wept constantly for sinners, spending entire nights begging God with passionate desperation to save them from eternal damnation. Her prayers had grown increasingly bold, increasingly willing to offer anything, including her own self, for the rescue of others. Contemporary accounts preserve a prayer that Catherine was known to make regularly during this period. A prayer so extreme in its audacity that it shocked even her most devoted followers. She begged God to place her at the very mouth of hell itself, so that she could physically block souls from entering that terrible place. "Let me stand at the entrance to that abyss of suffering," she would pray, tears streaming down her face. "Let anyone who tries to pass into that place of eternal torment have to push through my body first. Perhaps if they see me standing there, they will turn back. Perhaps I can be a barrier between them and eternal death." It was a strange and terrible prayer, unprecedented in its scope and its willingness to suffer. But God, it seems, decided to answer it, though not in the way that Catherine had anticipated. One day, while deep in prayer, Catherine suddenly collapsed. Her body went completely rigid. Her followers rushed to her side, calling her name over and over, shaking her shoulders. But she did not respond at all. Someone checked her breathing. There was none. Someone felt for her pulse. There was none. Her eyes were fixed and staring at nothing. Hour after hour she lay there, suspended between life and death, her body growing cold and stiff, while the people who loved her most watched in helpless anguish. The room filled with terrified whispers and muffled sobs. Some of her followers began making funeral arrangements. The historical accounts record that neighbors were called in to prepare all things for the burial. But Raymond of Capua, Catherine's confessor and spiritual director, remained steadfastly by her side, watching and praying without ceasing. He had witnessed too many extraordinary events in Catherine's life to assume that physical death was the final word. Something was happening in the unseen world, he was certain. Something beyond human comprehension, but perhaps not beyond her extraordinary reach. And then, after 4 hours of absolute stillness, Catherine gasped violently back to life. The Catherine who opened her eyes after those 4 hours was not the same woman who had closed them. Her face was pale, almost translucent, drained of all color. Her hands trembled uncontrollably, and her entire body was racked with violent shivering despite the summer heat. When she tried to speak, the words came out in fragments, broken by sobs that seemed to emerge from somewhere far deeper than her physical lungs. My soul was delivered out of this mortal body, she whispered hoarsely to those gathered around her. The room fell absolutely silent. Everyone leaned in, straining to hear. I saw the pains of hell and of purgatory, and no human tongue could ever describe what I witnessed there. If mortals could see even a glimpse of what I have seen, they would gladly endure any suffering on earth, any torment, any agony, any persecution, any death, rather than risk spending even a single moment in that place of unspeakable horror. According to the traditional accounts preserved by Raymond of Capua and other early biographers who interviewed witnesses to these events, Catherine described a journey through the afterlife that began with a descent into absolute, impenetrable darkness. But this was not mere darkness as we understand it, not simply the absence of light that we experience when we close our eyes or walk into a room without windows. This was darkness as a substance, a presence, a crushing weight that pressed in from all sides with suffocating intensity. It was darkness you could feel on your skin, darkness that seemed to have texture and mass and malevolent purpose. It was darkness that invaded your mouth and nose and lungs with every desperate attempt to breathe. It was darkness that whispered terrible things, darkness that hated with an intensity beyond human comprehension, darkness that knew your name and all your most shameful secrets. The darkness of hell, Catherine indicated, was not simply the absence of God's light. It was the active, terrible presence of God's absence. It was what happens when a soul that was created specifically for divine love, a soul designed in its very essence to receive and return God's infinite affection, is cut off from that love forever. The damned soul does not simply miss God the way a child misses a parent who has gone on a journey and will eventually return. The soul experiences its eternal separation from God as an unbearable, unending, ever-increasing anguish that never diminishes by even the smallest degree and never finds even a moment's relief. It is an eternal dying that never reaches the peace of death, an infinite falling that never reaches any bottom, a hunger that grows more desperate with every passing moment throughout all eternity. But the darkness was only the beginning of what Catherine witnessed. She spoke of pains that defied any earthly comparison. Fire, yes, the ancient tradition of hellfire is present in her account, but fire utterly unlike any flame that burns on earth. This fire gave no light. It provided no warmth. It only consumed endlessly, ravenously, without ever destroying what it burned, so that the suffering could continue forever without pause or end. The souls she witnessed were not merely passive victims of external torment, like prisoners being punished by jailers. They were, in a terrible and mysterious sense, creating their own suffering. Each soul was forever imprisoned within the very sins it had loved during its earthly life. The proud soul was trapped in a prison of its own ego, unable to escape its own thoughts. The hateful soul was consumed by its own hatred, now turned entirely inward. The lustful soul was tormented by desires that could never be satisfied, an eternal hunger that grew worse with every passing moment. The damned hate their own existence, Catherine would later write, reflecting on what she had witnessed. They wished desperately that they could simply cease to be, that they could be annihilated, that they could disappear into nothingness and escape their suffering. But they cannot cease to be. God created them for eternity, and eternity is what they have received. But an eternity of self-chosen darkness, rather than the eternal light they were made to enjoy. Perhaps most disturbing of all was what Catherine reported about the demons who inhabited that realm of darkness. They were not external torturers assigned to punish the wicked. They were, instead, the final and permanent companions of souls who had chosen darkness over light. The damned and the demons were united in hatred of God. Yet this terrible unity brought them no comfort whatsoever. Even in their shared rebellion, they tortured one another endlessly. But Catherine's journey through eternity did not end in the regions of the damned. She was also shown purgatory, and what she witnessed there was, in its own way, equally profound and equally transformative for her understanding of God's love. Purgatory, in the teaching of the Catholic Church, is not a second chance for souls who died in rebellion against God. It is not a place where the damned can somehow work their way up to heaven through enough suffering. Rather, it is a place of purification for souls who died in God's grace and friendship, souls who truly loved God and are destined for eternal happiness, but who still carry within them the wounds, attachments, and disordered desires of their earthly sins. Purgatory is where everything that would prevent a soul from experiencing the full presence of God's infinite love is burned away. Catherine saw these souls undergoing sufferings that, in many outward respects, resembled those of hell. There was fire here too. Fire that burned with tremendous intensity, consuming everything impure, everything false, everything that did not belong to God's perfect design. The pain was real, intense, excruciating beyond anything experienced on earth. But there was one crucial difference. The souls in purgatory suffered with hope. They knew their purification would end. They knew every moment of pain was bringing them closer to God. They actually desired their suffering because without this purification, they would be incapable of receiving the boundless love for which they had been created. Catherine would later develop this insight in her famous work, The Dialogue, where she described the nature of purgatorial fire in the voice of God the Father. This fire does not torment for the sake of torment. It does not punish for the sake of punishment. It heals. It burns away only what should not be there. The soul in purgatory would not wish to escape this fire, even if it could, because it knows with perfect clarity that without this cleansing, it could not bear the overwhelming weight of my glory. Imagine a person covered in infected wounds, bathing in salt water. The pain would be terrible, but they would endure it knowing the salt was cleaning the wounds, promoting healing. The souls in purgatory experience something similar. They embrace suffering because they understand its purpose. Catherine also witnessed souls being aided by the prayers of the living. She saw specific souls receiving relief because somewhere on earth, someone was praying for them, offering masses for their intention. The connection between the living and the dead was not broken by death. It became more intense and more important. Finally, at the end of her journey, Catherine was permitted to glimpse heaven itself. But here, perhaps surprisingly, she had the least to say. It was not that heaven made less of an impression on her than hell or purgatory. Quite the opposite. She indicated that heaven had affected her more profoundly than anything else. The problem was not lack of impact, but lack of adequate words. Heaven exceeded the capacity of human language to describe. Our words were created to express earthly realities. They were never designed to capture realities that lie beyond all earthly experience. Hell could be compared, however inadequately, to earthly suffering, magnified to infinity, stripped of all hope, extended through all eternity, but still recognizable. Purgatory could be understood as a kind of spiritual hospital. But heaven was something altogether different, something that broke every category of human thought. Catherine spoke of light, but not light as we know it on earth. This was light that did not hurt the eyes, no matter how intense it became. It was light that seemed to be alive, personal, loving. It was light that communicated directly to the soul without need for words or thoughts or concepts. It was light that was also, somehow, music and fragrance and embrace. She spoke of joy, but again, not joy as we experience it in our mortal lives. Earthly joy always comes mixed with the shadow of its own ending. We enjoy a beautiful sunset knowing darkness will follow. We embrace our loved ones knowing separation will come. Every earthly happiness is haunted by the knowledge that it cannot last. But the joy of heaven had no shadow, no fear of ending, no anxiety about the future. It was joy that grew eternally, deepening forever without ever reaching any limit. Most of all, Catherine spoke of love. The souls in heaven were completely united with God in a love that satisfied every desire, fulfilled every longing, healed every wound. All the pain of earthly life was not simply forgotten, but transformed, revealed as having been necessary steps on the journey to infinite happiness. Eye has not seen, ear has not heard, Catherine would quote from Scripture, what God has prepared for those who love Him. She believed this verse with all her being. And yet, despite its indescribable glory, Catherine was told she could not remain in that place of light. She had been granted this vision for a purpose, not her own enjoyment, but the salvation of others. Return to earth, the voice commanded, for the salvation of many souls. When Catherine awoke from her mystical death and returned to the world of the living, she did not immediately resume her normal activities. The historical accounts record that she wept continuously for 3 days and 3 nights. Not occasional tears shed at intervals throughout the day, not periods of weeping followed by rest, continuous, unbroken, seemingly inconsolable crying. Her companions were bewildered. They expected her to return filled with peace and joy. Instead, she seemed utterly broken. She could not eat. She could barely speak. All she could do was weep. When she finally recovered enough strength to explain, her words carried a weight that silenced everyone who heard them. She was not weeping for herself. She was not weeping because the vision had been painful. She was weeping for humanity. Having seen with her own spiritual eyes what awaited souls who rejected God's love, having witnessed the eternal darkness, the unquenchable fire, the desperate suffering, she could no longer look at sinners the same way. Every person walking down the narrow streets of Siena was walking either toward infinite happiness or toward eternal suffering. Every moment that passed, souls were dying somewhere in the world and facing judgment. "How can I possibly be happy?" she cried through her tears, "when I know that souls are falling into hell like snowflakes falling from the winter sky?" How can I rest for even a moment when every hour that passes might be the last opportunity for someone to turn back to God? This overwhelming grief for souls would never leave Catherine for the rest of her life. It became the driving force behind everything she did for the remaining 10 years of her earthly existence. She would push her body to its absolute breaking point, all driven by the living memory of what she had seen during those 4 hours when her soul departed her body. She became, in a sense, a woman possessed not by demons, but by love. She could not bear to see anyone lost. She would do anything, sacrifice anything, suffer anything, to prevent even one soul from experiencing what she had witnessed in the darkness. The years following Catherine's mystical death were a whirlwind of activity that continues to astonish historians. Consider who she was. A woman with no formal education in an age when women were rarely taught to read. A member of a middle-class family with no political connections. Someone in a society where women were expected to remain silent and invisible. Yet within a few short years, this young woman was dictating letters to popes, emperors, kings, and queens. She was advising cardinals on theology. She was negotiating peace treaties between warring Italian city-states. She was traveling to foreign courts as an ambassador, speaking with an authority that silenced skeptics and converted enemies. Most remarkably of all, she accomplished what no cardinal, no emperor, no army had achieved. She convinced Pope Gregory V to return the papacy from Avignon, France, to Rome, ending nearly 70 years of exile. Imagine a young woman from Siena standing before the Pope himself, telling him he was failing his duty to God and being obeyed. She also wrote one of the enduring masterworks of Christian mysticism. The Dialogue, a conversation between a soul and God the Father, exploring the deepest mysteries of salvation, sin, grace, and divine love. This work would eventually earn her the title of Doctor of the Church, one of only 4 women in Catholic history to receive this honor. Throughout all of this, she never forgot what she had seen. References to hell and purgatory appear throughout her writings, always with the same urgent message. Eternity is real. Your choices matter infinitely. Every soul is precious beyond all earthly measure. She pushed herself relentlessly. She slept barely an hour each night. She ate almost nothing. Her followers begged her to rest, to take care of herself. "I cannot rest," she would tell them. "Every moment I rest, souls are being lost. How can I rest when the stakes are infinite?" Witnesses testified to extraordinary phenomena. During her ecstasies, her face would transform with supernatural light, and she would sometimes levitate off the ground. Raymond of Capua claimed to have witnessed this personally. Her body might be seen raised in the air, contrary to the laws of gravity, as I myself can testify. She also received the stigmata, the wounds of Christ in her hands, feet, and side. She asked that these wounds remain invisible during her lifetime, but she felt them constantly, a permanent, physical reminder of Christ's suffering for souls. By 1380, Catherine's body was completely broken. She was 33 years old, the same age as Christ at his crucifixion. But she looked like an old woman. Her years of extreme fasting and relentless work had taken a terrible toll. In January, she suffered a massive stroke that left her partially paralyzed. But even this did not stop her mission. She continued to pray, continued to dictate letters, continued to intercede for souls with every remaining breath. On April 29, 1380, surrounded by her devoted followers, Catherine breathed her last. Her final words were a prayer. Blood, blood, a reference to Christ's blood that she believed could save souls from the fate she had witnessed 10 years earlier. With her dying breath, she was still pleading for souls. She was canonized in 1461. In 1970, she was declared a Doctor of the Church. Her body remains in Rome, in the Church of Santa Maria sopra Minerva, where pilgrims still come to pray at her tomb. What are we to make of Catherine's vision? Skeptics will dismiss it as hallucination, a product of extreme fasting and religious conditioning. Perhaps. But Catherine was subjected to intense scrutiny during her lifetime. Church authorities tested her repeatedly. She passed every test they could devise. More importantly, the fruits of her vision, the transformation of her life, the power of her teaching, the impact on history, suggest something more than delusion. Hallucinations do not typically produce saints and doctors of the Church. Mental illness does not usually result in works of profound theological insight that remain influential after 600 years. Whether one believes Catherine literally traveled to hell, purgatory, and heaven, or understands her experience as mystical vision communicating deep truths through symbolic images, the essential message remains the same. Eternity is real. Our choices matter infinitely more than we usually recognize. And love, God's love for us and our love for God and neighbor, is the only thing that ultimately determines our eternal destiny. Catherine would care little about our debates. What she would care about is whether we heard the message. She did not endure 3 days of inconsolable weeping so that people could argue about mystical states. She did it so that we would wake up, so that we would realize our lives are eternal dramas whose ending is not yet written, so that we would understand that hell is real but not inevitable, that heaven is real and available to all who choose it, and that purgatory is real because God loves us too much to let us enter His presence still carrying the wounds of our sins. 650 years after her death, Catherine of Siena still speaks with an urgency that transcends centuries. Do not waste your life. Do not squander your days while eternity hangs in the balance. Do not let a single soul be lost if there is anything within your power to save them. She entered hell for 1 hour, though historical sources record it as 4 hours of apparent death, and she never forgot what she saw. Perhaps we should not forget either.